Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I've been a lover of Indian music, South Asian music, since I was a budding little hippie freak in high school. And of course, like any self-respecting hippie freak, I would listen to Ravi Shankar and get into the sort of the mystical ambiance of Indian drones. I went to see Ravi Shankar during high school when I was a kid, and it was probably the first time I had a truly ecstatic experience listening to music, sort of in my inner self, rather than just because I was dancing and having a goofy time. And that really opened a door, and I kept being interested in Indian music and got interested in Bollywood stuff back in the early '90s when it was not available on every in every record shop in some fancy hipster collection. I was watched the Brooklyn public access shows, and they on the local cable station, they would show all the old filmy geets, and so I got into R.D. Burman and all these characters and wrote about that stuff. And one of the wonderful things about Indian music, both popular and classical, is just that it's a lifelong process of even beginning to grok it. I've been reading and listening to it for decades now, and I'm really bare. Maybe I'm out of kindergarten. Maybe I'm in first grade. but but there's something wonderful about that. A lot of other things in my life, I feel like I've gotten to a point where I kind of get what's going on, and maybe it's a mop-up operation to appreciate the variations. But Indian music is an infinite universe, and also brings together art, aesthetics, and what I can only call spirituality. And that for me, it's one of the most spiritual of musics, even though it can also be entertaining and bizarre and exuberant. And so you can imagine my glee when I went to see Richard Bishop, who we had on the show a couple of months ago. We were talking about esoteric books on the show, but of course I first met Richard in his context as being a musician in the Sun City Girls, and then as a solo performer under the name Sir Richard Bishop. So I went to see Richard and ran into another Sublime Frequencies crony, and Robert Millis, and who performed wonderfully, did a great set. He's a guitarist and composer in his own right, but he was selling at the merch table, in addition to Sublime Frequencies discs. He's put together a lot of these compilations, and some of their videos were shot by him on his travels, listening to music, and he's done a lot of the covers for Sublime Frequencies. So if you're into the Sublime Frequencies vibe, you have Robert partly to thank for it. But there was a book that I just hadn't come across called Indian Talking Machine, which was put together by Rob when he got a Fulbright to go to India to study 78s and the whole culture of collecting and listening that surrounds 78s everywhere. But he was particularly interested in Indian music, and I love 78s. I don't collect them myself, but I do collect recording CDs and other forms of 78 recordings, just because there's something so enchanting and marvelous and uncanny and spectral about 78 sounds. And so what a wonderful project. And indeed, the book Indian Talking Machine is a wonderful book, which I'm sad to say is I think basically out of print now. Sublime Frequencies has a style of, like, they make a certain amount of whatever they're putting out, and they put it out there, and it goes fast or it goes slow, and then that's it, guys. Move on to the next project. But luckily, Rob's done a lot of stuff, and a lot of other things are available online that have spun off from his Indian extravagant experiences. And so you're not out of luck. to taste some of the music that he's collected and some of the images and ideas he has about Indian music. So with no further ado, Rob, thanks for joining us on Expanding Mind.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for the swell introduction. I
Yeah.
understand exactly what you mean about Indian music. There's a quote I read somewhere, I can't exactly put my finger on it, but it was like someone that goes to India for 2 weeks thinks that they can write a book. Someone that goes to India then for a month thinks that they can only write an article, and someone that goes there for a year has no clue what to say, because it's that kind of country. It's like it's so, it just goes deeper and deeper the more you scratch at it.
Yeah, I always thought it was I really admired the whole style of the sort of Sublime Frequencies musical explorations, because you go with a certain kind of goal that can organize the chaos of being in a foreign country, in a place where there's so much going on, there's so many opportunities, there's so much confusion. It gives you like a certain focus, but it's this kind of focus that's just going to draw you deeper into the mystery. And
well, I'm really thankful to Alan Bishop, and actually the early days of Sublime Frequencies, it was started by Alan Bishop, Richard Bishop, and Sean Mayette. Rick is no longer really part of the label, but even before I knew those guys, I would be traveling and I'd always record. I always had my little DAT recorder, I guess, back in the 90s, and cassette before that. And music, and looking for interesting musical performances or recordings, was always kind of a way to focus a trip that I was on. And then it was just amazing. Obviously, Sun City Girls have always done that. And it was great that they started that record label, because it really helped provide an outlet for a lot of us weirdos who were traveling that way.
Oh yeah, I think it's definitely been one of the more interesting labels, I think, in the last, 10, 15 years at all, just in terms of creating a new space, really a new, what I like about Sublime Frequencies is that it gives permission. It gives permission both to other amateurs to go out and make the recordings you want to on the road, and, gather weird cassettes and, go ahead, do it. You don't need a degree. You don't need an official backing. You don't need to be a professional ethnomusicologist. And it also gives permission to listeners for a certain kind of raw listening that, in a kind of politically correct era, and for good reasons, in many ways, that I think there's a kind of constipation around listening to other people's music, because it's like, well, I don't know anything about it, so I have to be very cautious and not be not fall into exoticism or fall into desire too much, because it's too unruly. But then what you get is anodyne music. You get people who are like, well, it's safe to listen to exported world music, slick stuff, because then I know that I'm part of the audience. But if I listen to something that I don't understand at all, well, I don't really have the right to do that, because I'm just a colonialist, or I'm just an ignorant person, or whatever, I mean. And it's a very common thing in world music, and Sublime Frequencies created a different space for it.
Exactly. And yeah, I mean, don't get me started. That's just the whole way we listen to world music and music from other cultures is sort of part of the problem in culture these days, but that's a separate diatribe. But for sure, there's no reason why say, where I live in Seattle, I can go out and casually see a bunch of bands, like stuff, not like stuff, form my own opinions about it. Someone might say, well, that's a terrible example of Northwest grunge rock. Why are you listening to that? Well, it appeals to me. And the same thing can happen when you travel in other countries. You collect music, you listen to it. Sublime really allowed people to bring their own personal feelings, preconceptions into the music, and enjoy it for what it was, rather than for what it was supposed to be or supposed to mean to them. And that was great, liberating for a lot of people, I think, a lot of listeners and people who went out to make recordings and collected stuff.
Talk about getting this Fulbright. I mean, here you are. You're an outside freelance musician, weirdo, collector guy. It's a zone I have always had great admiration for, and spent a lot of time there myself. And it's not something I associate with like scoring a Fulbright or even thinking that you could score a Fulbright. Because I mean, I think of the Fulbright as this like really high end, fancy pants sort of award that you can get, or a research project you can get that you need to be in an Ivy League or some kind of thing like that. So, how did you even have the idea that they might give you some cash?
Tell me about it. And to all the kids listening out there, it just goes to show you that any idiot can get whatever he wants if you just put your mind to it. Well, I've kind of dabbled around the sound art field for many years. I played in an experimental music band for many years. I mean, I still do, called Climax Golden Twins. That was initially sort of very improvisational and very oriented towards field recording as well, actually, and oriented towards listening to unusual sounds, trying to do things with instruments that were a little different. And that led naturally to meeting a lot of artists here in Seattle, and occasionally working with them doing sound for an installation, some kind of field recording collage for for a painter's show that he made these paintings in Italy. And that artist, his name is Donald Fells, had actually gotten several Fulbrights. And I was always talking about 78s and my desire to travel and to learn more about it. And I'd actually gone to India in 2008 and managed to meet a collector or two. And because I liked 78s and I also was interested in Indian music, I really wanted to learn more about Indian music. And I thought that 78s and Indian record collectors might be a better entree to it than, as you were saying, the typical sort of world music CDs or Wikipedia pages that you can otherwise find. And my friend, the artist here in Seattle, just encouraged me to apply for a Fulbright. He said India has a lot of openings, and it might just be a crazy enough idea that they'll fund some of your research. So I did, and there you go. It happened.
Well, it's such a great project, just the crossover of the sort of two elements, the 78s and and Indian music, which in some way is so constrained by the 78 form, by the 3-minute form.
Very much
it's
is.
like you have these people who are trained their whole lives to do long improvisations, and then they're sitting there with this weird machine and being like, come on, get it down to 3 minutes. And a lot of them do, and they do a great job at it, but it's so transformative from what the context of the more traditional context of the musical performances. It's really kind of a remarkable sort of meeting point. And, I guess we could talk about it from either end, but maybe talk a little bit about what 78s have meant for you, why you were already interested in them, what's particular about the 78 and the collecting of them that inspires you to explore it in an Indian context.
Well, let's see. It goes way back. It goes way back for me, even to when I was a wee bairn. Listening to, oddly enough, I was listening to. I accidentally bought a record for my father for Christmas one year. That was Jelly Roll Morton, and I really I was listening to rock and roll and the Beatles or whatever I was listening to. And I wanted to get my dad a jazz record that I'd done a play in high school or something, and then used contemporary versions of Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll Morton was a famous, basically he claims to have invented jazz. He was a 20s New Orleans jazz piano player. It was amazing. And I went out and I bought a record for my dad thinking that it was going to be these contemporary versions. And it actually turned out to be a compilation of the original songs from the 20s. And my dad didn't really give a crap, as fathers often do with Christmas presents. You never know what to get them. And then, but I started listening to it, and there was something about it that it just got into my subconscious. There was especially a couple of tracks that had little vaudeville numbers at the beginning when they'd actually speak, and the sort of the slangs and the dialect really appealed to me. The sound of the voices from almost 100 years ago really started appealing to me. And then with 78s, they're very immediate. There's no, basically you'd go in, you'd be in front of a horn or in front of a microphone once they invented microphones in the mid-20s, and you had your one shot. You could do a couple of takes, but there was no overdubbing. There was no studio sweetening afterwards. And maybe it's a fantasy on my part, but to me, a lot of music from that time has this immediate quality to it, that you really feel like there's very little between you and the performer, except for a lot of surface noise on the record. But there's an immediacy there that appealed to me greatly. And a little bit later in life, a friend was in Korea, and I asked him to bring back some music from Korea, and he, again, an accident, he brought me a CD that was all older Korean recordings on from 78, and it just sounded so amazing to me. The mystery surrounding it, with all these deep crackles, and the music was practically subsumed under this surface noise, and it sounded so mysterious, so alien. And of course, I was kind of pretty into noise music at that point and experimental music, so it just sounded like an experimental music. And then I started going out and looking for 78s and realized it was a very cheap way to find new music. Because at that time they were only 25 cents, 50 cents. You could go to a thrift store and buy a stack of records. I started becoming very interested in the early players and Edison and how he invented recording, how the different machines were made. It's kind of an extension of instrument building, and I found that to be super fascinating. And we started incorporating 78 RPM sounds, samples, surface noise stuff into the Climax Golden Twins experimental music that we were making. And eventually we started making a series of cassettes that was just called Victrola Favorites, that was just recorded straight off of an old gramophone. We just wind it up and play records and record them. And that was actually, oddly enough, popular enough that the record label Dust to Digital contacted us, that is myself and Jeffrey Taylor, who were in Climax Golden Twins. And they wanted to do some kind of big project based on Victrola Favorites. So we did a book based on our record collection, shows a lot of the graphics from the early recording era, which I love too, the 20s graphics, sleeve designs, label designs, really beautiful. Lettering, hand lettering. So that came out in about 2008, and it was sort of the direct inspiration to make the Indian Talking Machine book. I started to just be more interested in 78s. I started to, as I was reading about the history of it, there was this guy, Fred Gaisberg, who was there right at the beginning of the invention of records. He was the assistant to Emil Berliner, who invented the actual flat disc record as we know it today. And this is in the late 1890s. And he went off to England initially and set up a company there, the Gramophone Company, which eventually became EMI. And he started traveling the world recording, essentially to make recordings so that they could sell gramophones to different communities. And something about his work resonated with me with Sublime Frequencies, in that he was traveling around and recording. And that led me to his first overseas expedition to Asia, which was to India. And I realized those the first recordings made outside of a Western context. And so that's really what led me into the Indian 78 world.
Well, it's a fascinating thing. Just that, one, when you realize that they first started making records in order to sell the gramophones themselves,
right.
But then the weird way that though overall you can think about the long arc of recording and using electricity to capture and reproduce music, and then having recordings, et cetera, as being kind of overall a shrinking force, and that diversity is ultimately woven into this kind of broadening market where there's a kind of collapse of difference into this recorded space.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, it's this incredible explosion because they want to sell gramophones to everybody. They want to sell gramophones to the Poles and the Italians and the Jews
and
the
the
blacks
Indians and the Spanish,
Indians.
whatever. Yeah.
And so there's this drive to go out and record and collect. And that was really when I started listening to more 78s, again, not collecting them myself, but seeking out collections and compilations that others had done of 78s, was not just being into, country blues and stuff like that, or raw gospel music, which I'm also a fan of. But once it just dawned on me that the extent of the recordings across the planet and with all of these different genres, then it's super amazing. Because even though you can, as you said, there's an immediacy to these recordings that is coupled with a distance, a kind of mystery, and the combination of the two is really delicious. And as you said, there's a kind of romantic sense that there's something more direct about these recordings, even though they're so much farther off in time. But it is true that even if you're kind of like, look, these guys, they're performing, some of them have careers, they're very aware that these things are calling cards, they're part of their business as musicians and blah, blah. Even if you have kind of a disenchanted view, it's still the case that the people who are being recorded on a lot of these discs, that's it. They're the first generation to do that. They're the first generation to meet that whole recording apparatus of modernity. And
imagine
hearing something special there.
Imagine hearing you probably did when you were a kid and you first played with a cassette machine or something and you heard your own voice played back to you. I mean, imagine that on a societal, cultural level, There'd been nothing like that for thousands of years of human history, and then all of a sudden. And another thing that was interesting about that early time is that the recording engineers, people like Gaisberg, they had no idea what to record. And that was especially true in America, which gave rise to the great Paramount label and all of these great blues artists, as you mentioned, that were recorded. They didn't know what to record. They were just trying to record something to appeal to black people to buy gramophones, to buy Victrolas. So they would record anyone. And that led to such an amazing breadth of music that might not have been recorded if people thought about it in a different way. They were just trying to get anything onto disc. So, and I think that also worked in India. They recorded a lot of people that might not have otherwise been recorded, a lot of oddball musicians, a lot of people that only recorded once, but thank God they did, because it's very unique.
So the Indian Talking Machine has 2 CDs in it of things from your own collection, presumably mostly bought when you were doing your India travels. I wanted just to get, if you could give a tale of like a favorite recording or a circumstance where you found a recording that was particularly evocative, or just a little flavor of like what it's like to be a 78 collector and to go out on hunting down in these dusty markets and finally find a stack. And as you see in the photographs in the book, I mean, a lot of them are just in the most degraded condition possible, covered with dust, piled up without any sleeves, in the back corner next to a bunch of statues. I mean, it's just, it's very much you really have to be hunting for these things. And yet you turned up a lot of really terrific music. I mean, it's really, I've listened to other collections of, even Indian 78s and other world music 78s, and it's really quite a range. I mean, a very, very, quite a varied collection. So I was wondering if you could just, grab a track or a story of finding it.
Well, God, there's so many. And I mean, just a brief aside, the range was a very conscious choice on my part. I mean, really, Indian Talking Machine is as much about me learning about Indian music, but also trying to kind of understand a little bit more about what collecting records are and is, or whatever it is. because it's a very peculiar impulse. And so I wanted then the tracks to all be from my own collection. But I think that one track for sure that jumps out at me is this amazing singer called Babu Agor Nath Chakrabarti. And I'd gone to talk to an archivist who actually was a professor at a university in Calcutta, and he mentioned I was talking about the early my interest in early discs, and he was talking about his archive and so on, and I was kind of interviewing him, and he mentioned this artist Babu Agor Nath Chakrabarti as being extremely rare and as being someone that was recorded essentially in secret, which is nearly impossible in the early days of recording because the apparatus was big. It was acoustic. There was a big horn you had to sing directly into. But the mystery surrounding it from collectors for all these years had been that he was recorded against his will. And I said, well, I really want to hear this. This sounds quite interesting. And he said, you will never find this record. You'll never find that record. It's very rare. And I swear to God, I think I went out that evening because there's record dealers hidden in weird little parts of Calcutta, and I found a copy of one of his records immediately. Turns out it wasn't the one that he was talking about. This guy actually only made 2 records, and it's the other one that's very rare. Though this one was equally actually quite as rare. And it was from 1903. It was recorded in 1903, probably released in 1904. And the reason that they think he was recorded in secret is that there's no accompaniment. So it's just a weird story that collectors built up over all these years that he was recorded in secret because he didn't want to record. He was a very, very well-known musician, extremely aesthetic. He eventually gave up working in music and moved to Varanasi and sort of retreated from life in his later years. But it's a very unusual and beautiful record, and it's on the second disc on Indian Talking Machine.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll take a listen to that one right now. So we're just going to hear an excerpt from Babu Agor Nath Chakrabarti.
Let me do it for you. Babu Agor Nath Chakrabarti.
Chakrabarti. That's amazing. Sounds like a trucker name or something.
It's a common Bengali name, actually.
Chakrabarti?
Yeah. It's probably pronounced differently. It's written in different ways, but
great. Well, we'll hear this just a short excerpt from that right now.
दिल बहार बनिया नजर दिल बहार बनिया ले ले बे नजर दिल बहार बनिया ले ले बे
All right, that was a song from Bengal recorded probably 1903, 1904. And when you listen to things that, that were recorded that long ago, it also brings up this whole question, the sort of spectral side of recording, which I know you're interested in, and I know it's also in some ways part of the Sublime Frequencies aesthetic. There's a certain evocation of the ghostly, the spectral, the dead. And I know you've done a project called Jewel of the Year, which involves some of the Indian recording material that you had and ideas that you had when you were out there, that kind of turns on this notion of like the 78 becomes this strange kind of body that holds an aspect of the spirit or the voice or the person. Even as the actual person dies and their body decays, there's some kind of literal inscription. And that's part of I think the magic of 78s too, is that right in contemporary times, we think of recording, everything is just digital, everything gets translated into these numbers, which then become these abstract databases in all these different formats, and it's very disembodied. But when you're talking about, especially these early recordings before the electrical microphone, you're really just talking about there's a human body. They're making noise. They're modulating the pressure in the air, and that pressure is inscribing itself essentially directly onto this piece of shellac. And then when you play it back, you're like kind of just picking up those series of pressures. So it is very intimate and close, and yet again, the more time that comes across, the more spectral everything becomes. The more there's a
mysterious,
spookiness.
Yeah.
So what was Jewel of the Year about, and how are you playing with those ideas in terms of making this other project?
Well, Jewel of the Year it's kind of exactly that. It grew out of while I was in India on my Fulbright, I met a Swiss sound artist named Gilles Aubry, who was there researching Bollywood for a separate project. And we just kind of randomly met one night in Mumbai and kind of kept in touch. And the project sort of developed from an idea of Gilles a few years later. Basically, he'd made a lot of recordings of cremations, which are a very common occurrence in India. Essentially, bodies are burned once you die. And there was a kind of a surface connection, but a very interesting one between recordings that he'd made of cremations, the crackling fire sounds, and then the crackling 78 sounds. And so that kind of was the starting point for us as a sort of improvisational sound art experiment. And from there, we've done a series of recordings. We actually went back to India and did some shows in India and some more research there. But it came to be about this sort of what is recording and what does it mean, and how does what happens to the voice once it's recorded? What does it mean to preserve something? There was a very strong fascination in Victorian England and in America, and some people have suggested that the development of recording kind of came from this, which is this desire to preserve life after death. And in fact, the original logo, His Master's Voice, was a dog listening to a recording of his master. And the original painting of this, the dog is sitting on a coffin. So the idea being that his master is gone, but he can still hear these recordings. And is it the same thing as the living master? How does the dog react to it? So that was kind of the basis of Jewel of the Year. And like I said, we've done some performances and some recordings. We've done some radio shows. We actually just did a big piece for Documenta in Europe. And we're probably going to be doing some records based on this in the near future.
Sounds great. I did want to ask you a little bit about, since we're talking about, issues of creation, destruction, death, the spectral, about the sort of, for lack of a better term, spirituality of this music, or the sense of where Indian music can take you, even when you're not necessarily very well versed in what's happening. You can't necessarily count the beats or recognize the raga, or be able to appreciate the incredible control that so many of these master musicians have over tiny little variations that are the kinds of things that the connoisseurs cream in their jeans over. But even when you don't have that sort of facility, there's still something really remarkable that happens, even for people, even, in a kind of pop way. People sort of associate these sounds, there's this kind of resonance, the vibration, the drone sound. It conjures something, for folks. What do you think what's going on here? What is it about this vast tradition of music that has this sort of special claim, at least in my experience, on sacred music?
Well, that is a huge question, and it is really interesting. And all of that other stuff you mentioned, ultimately, the recognizing the raga or counting the tals, the beats, is kind of superficial. It's just another way to get inside the music, but I don't know. In a lot of ways, that's why I did a Fulbright. I wanted to go to India to try to understand this music more. When the thing that got me about Indian music, or let's see, the recording that first blew me away was by the Dagar brothers. I'm not sure if you're familiar, probably are. Specifically the recordings of the Rudra Veena, which is a stringed instrument from North India, and it's got a very low sound. Someone bought a CD of this at a record store I worked in Seattle, and I asked them. I wasn't particularly interested in Indian music at this time, and I said, "Why did you buy this?" And they just looked at me in this very strange way and said, "It goes very deep." And I thought, well, I could give it a try. And it was actually 2 CDs. The first CD being just the Alap, which is the rhythmless sort of exploration of the raga that these musicians do. And it just went, he was exactly right. It just went someplace very quickly that was beyond words. And I'm not sure if it is got to do with the time-based aspect. I mean, if you devote yourself to an hour of music like that, you will have a pretty internal experience. Also, the instruments in India have been so developed over so many years to get at a spiritual space, to get inside. I'm talking hundreds of years. That it's very hard to not have that experience. When I think about the electric guitar, for example, the guitar is amazing and it's very versatile and it's used in all over the world. But the minute you use an Indian instrument in another context, you immediately know it's an Indian instrument. You know, the sitar has a specific sound. They all do, and I think that a lot of that, the sympathetic strings that a lot of Indian instruments have, which are these strings that you don't play but they vibrate in sympathy, in harmony with the strings you actually are playing. All of that goes towards creating this space which you can occupy with your part of your mind that is beyond words, I think. And I'm still trying to understand it, and part of me actually doesn't ever want to understand it, because once I came home from my Fulbright in India, and really almost to this day, Indian music, the classical music, is practically the only thing I really want to listen to. I still listen to other stuff, but there's something about it that just, it goes deep, as this person told me.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it can stir up obsession. Clearly, some of the characters you talked to when you were doing your research, the Indian 78 collectors were quite a quite a set of characters.
Yeah.
They were really amazing, kind of amazing people. Talk about, whatever. What are the guys you made the best connection with, or the situation that seemed the most representative of just how the particular characteristics of the 78 collector?
Well, God, I don't know, because I've talked to a lot of 78 collectors, even here in America. And one of the things I love is just in how people interact with their collections in different ways, and how some people are very clean and organized and some people are very chaotic. How some people are so impassioned about certain particular types of music. And it's at those points where you learn. There's so many. There's V.A.K. Ranga Rao, who is a collector in Chennai or Madras. He had what he claimed to be the biggest collection in all of India. He was a huge character, records stacked everywhere in his house, but he couldn't play any of them because all of the record players were broken or in the shop. And I love that. It was just someone sitting there. He'd listened to them all at some point, so all the knowledge was in his head, and he had this way of retaining it. But he couldn't actually listen to one of his records, but he wasn't going to get rid of any of them. There was other artists, actually, speaking of Babu Agornath Chakrabarti, another collector I met in Calcutta, Ranti Deb Moitra, he was great. He knew a lot about very specific types of Indian music, specifically Drupad. And the other Babu Agornath record, he had always wanted, and he knew of its existence, but there was one record dealer. Often record dealers in India are actually just little stalls on the street. They're not like a record store as we might know it here in the United States. Anyway, this guy had a copy of this record, the only copy that that this collector had ever seen, hanging on a string in his shop. And the collector described it as like he was fishing. He was fishing for the collector, and he was eventually going to reel him in with this piece of bait on the string, and get him to pay the money for it. And the same collector would also talk about how he would go to the red light districts. And what he meant by that was that most of the early discs of 78 recorded in India were recorded by women who were from the red light districts, because they were the only people that would record at that time. And so he would talk about going to the red light district, which just for him meant he was going to go listen to his very early recordings of female singers. So I don't know. There's too many characters. They're each one. I realized I was trying to look for some sort of through thread that might describe the collector mentality. And I also read a lot about collecting and museums at this time, and realized that they're all pretty. Everyone's got their own take on things. Everyone's different, and I'm happy to kind of leave it at that.
Yeah, no, that totally makes sense. So what are you going to, you have this big archive, you've had a lot of experience, you've done a lot of research. Are you going to continue to sort of work with this music in either in installations or further compilations and recordings?
Yeah, like I said, I'm too drawn into Indian music to let it go. It's not just a little thing for me. I'm going to be doing, I hope very soon in the future, if not a reissue of the book, probably I'll do some LPs on Sublime Frequency of more early recordings from India and more of my photographs, but it'll be an LP, kind of like a follow-up. I've also managed to connect to quite a lot of interesting artists and people in India, and I'm working on some projects with them. Another one specifically for Sublime Frequencies. I'm working on, there's a field recordist who actually is also an inspiration for Sublime Frequencies, named Deban Bhattacharya, who was from Calcutta. And if you look at almost any, not almost any, but many LPs of music from other countries, especially those released in the 60s and 70s, had his recordings on them. And he lived in Paris for a lot of his life, contributed to radio, contributed a lot of his field recordings to various record labels for release. He was an amateur, kind of in the same way that Sublime Frequencies is. He was not a trained ethnographer. But he loved music, and he got a tape recorder very early in the early 50s and started experimenting with it. And he was living in Paris, and he took a trip overland from Paris. This is in the 50s, from Paris all the way back to India. He drove through Iraq. He crossed from Iraq into Iran. This is in a VW bus. And he wrote a manuscript at that time about this trip, and it never got published. He also took many photographs and made many recordings along the way. A lot of the recordings have come out specifically on an LP called The Desert Road. But so I'm working with his widow, who I met in India, to do finally to publish this manuscript with some of the photos and perhaps an expanded collection of his field recordings. So that's another project that's grown out of having been in India.
Would you ever have you tried to play Indian music at all? I mean, I know you're also a musician.
No. As you know, it takes years, and for a very good reason. And I didn't want to be a dabbler. I'm not even. I still am confused by just the guitar, which I played for 7 million years. The idea of playing an Indian instrument, I'm sure I picked them up and dabbled at them, but I realize the respect a lot of people have for their instruments in India. And like I said, it's also, they're so designed to do what they're supposed to do that maybe another lifetime I can begin to approach learning an Indian instrument, but I don't need to now. It's not my thing.
Right. Well, it's funny too. I one of the keys that opened a big door in my appreciation for Indian music was was appreciating the role of the voice, and how in some ways the voice is the ultimate Indian instrument, and that a lot of other instruments can be seen as sort of playing with the voice, the way that in the West the violin plays with the human voice, and then through that starting to really appreciate the singers, because something about, I don't know how to say it. It's like you can appreciate the technical side of what they're doing more, because it's, after all, it's just a voice. It's just like a voice like you have, like it's your own instrument. You have one, but beginning to develop an appreciation for the microtonal control and some of the effects and some of the sort of ornamentation and the whole variety of ornamentation. It really that opened up a whole side of it. And again, I think like probably half your recordings in the Indian Talking Machine are vocal recordings too. And there's just something, again, special about the way in which the Indian tradition uses the voice that I think also kind of invites you in. And it's funny, I was at a hippie electronic music festival, but it was like super hippie. So they had like a stage that was all world music things, but they also had classes. So they had like a guy who was a Hindustani vocal, a white guy, but he'd studied with Pran Nath back in the day in the 70s and had kept it up. And then there was a guy who was a Qawwali dude, and they were doing lessons, and it was fascinating to sit in on them just to get a little taste, not so much of like being a dabbler in the musical performance, which I'm not even close to that, but just to have a sense of how the instruction happens, because of course all of these musicians, they're learning in a very, very well-defined way with very kind of unique forms of transmission and training, and a whole ethos of relating to the teacher. And I mean, that's part of the richness of the system, is the whole pedagogical environment that creates new performers, new students. And even just getting a tiny taste of that, opened my eyes to part of the reason for the depths of the tradition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the vocal styles are, watching people learn. I interviewed some vocal teachers, and yeah, it's just the amount of scales you have to learn. Also, the stories of how the class, because Indian music is all built on these schools of specific teachers, specific lineages of teachers, and you're absolutely right that the vocals are the most important thing. And even when you're learning tabla, say, or other instruments, you're very often singing the rhythms and the melodies that you're learning, so that you're internalizing them in several different ways. But there's so many great stories of early of the teachers and how they would treat their students. Aludin Khan, one of the great maestros who taught Ravi Shankar and others, he he would be brutal to his students. But apparently, deep down, he was a very, very sweet, wonderful, wonderful person. But he was brutal to his students to get them to learn in the way that he thought was important to them. And some of them he wouldn't even talk to, for the first year that they were there or something. He wouldn't show them anything, and they would just have to persevere because they knew it was going to be worth it. So it's a very deep, amazing tradition.
Yeah, and it's funny coming to it from more of the outside experimental rock zone or whatever.
Oh,
because
yes, exactly.
Because it's almost the opposite, is in the sense that even though experimental music, avant-garde music, free jazz, noise music, all of that stuff, it has its traditions or its lineages in a sense, but in a lot of other ways, it's it's inspired by the idea that you can make amazing things can happen like outside of training or beyond training or something like that.
Beyond training specifically, having spent enough time now listening to Indian music and seeing a lot of performances when I was there and so on, I've certainly been able to only occasionally, get beyond the technique, because the technique of these vocalists is absolutely staggering, and it's almost like I shouldn't even be allowed to criticize them because they've spent 40 years of their life training their voice. But still, I can actually a little bit appreciate when artists are taking that 40 years of training and doing something a little unique with it, pushing their voice, going beyond the training. And then some, you get the sense that they're just technical wizards, and they're just kind of going through the motions, and they don't actually have something emotional, something spiritual to say with their voice. It's something that's impossible to describe, and again, maybe it's just what I hear, but there's some singers that I've found can completely affect me with just a few notes, and some, to me, just sound like they're amazing, but they're going through some sort of motions.
Yeah, isn't that the term? I think it's called svara. There's a term for like that extra musical spirit. That,
or rasa too, yeah.
Right. And that's part of it too, is we get into these, you got to get into a whole different headspace in order to appreciate that. And clearly I'm psyched that you got psyched by it, because you made this great book, and now you've got these cool projects going and more projects, coming down the pike. I thought we would close the show by listening to another track. I just kind of grabbed it at random. This is a sitar instrumental from Professor Waliullah Khan. Do you have anything to say about that track?
Well, it's one of the people I couldn't find too much information about. I don't think he recorded too much. And again, he's another person from Calcutta, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And he, the term professor in the book, and indeed on all the other 78 compilation projects I've worked on over the years, I love to use the original, what the label printed, which is often misspelled or not, or they had the wrong instrument. I don't know why I like to do that, but I like, and then I'll explain in the notes often. But he wasn't really a professor. He was an ustad. He was but I love how in this label they just translated him to be a professor. I think that was also one that was recorded on a label called Hindustan Records, which started actually in Calcutta and was one of the first record labels that was exclusively owned and operated by Indian nationals. And it's got an extremely interesting history to it. It actually still exists today in one form or another. And I went to their original recording studios, and which is now just a storeroom in the basement of a building in Calcutta. But it was kind of great to be there among that history. Like with a lot of record labels the world over, but in India it seemed to be a particular problem. Record labels such as Hindustan Records, even though they still exist, their archives were just destroyed. They hadn't kept good archives. They'd crumbled away. They didn't even know what they had. So when I would ask about artists like this, no one really knew. They might be able to unearth a ledger that would have written in Bengali the date of his recording, but that's about it. No one knew about him. No one knew what the record number was, for example, things like that. So collectors are a very valuable resource for holding on to this stuff. And, you know, and India's got all kinds of issues with climate and with storage room and stuff. So who knows?
Yeah,
but
it's amazing. I think that's part of the mysterious vibe that we were talking about, is that these things are just on the edge of the void. You know, they're with one little trick of history differently, that they would never appear, or there would never be any information about them. So, well, anyway, Robert, thanks so much for talking with us on Expanding Mind, and I'll send people to your website through the link on the page, and people can dig around, and there's a lot of other images and recordings on that as well. So thanks again.
Yeah, thank you very much. And there's a lot of amazing Indian music when you get deep on YouTube. I mean, it's the YouTube quality, but still, there's a lot of stuff there. So,
absolutely.
Thanks again, Erik.
All righty. Well, we're going to go out here with sitar instrumental from the Professor. Until next week, keep your minds open.